we're talking about the anti-imperialistic message and, kind of seeing, okay, does it work? Does it not work? I think ultimately, you make the case that perhaps the left should drop the anti-imperialistic message to gain more traction. Kind of talk about that for us, please.
Yeah, yeah. So because there are so many people who want to believe that they live in good societies, it's hard to sell them a message which implicitly says that their tax money funds things that are evil, that when they vote for people, they're voting for people who are evil. Uh, those kinds of messages are difficult. People don't like to feel like they aid or abet evil. They don't like thinking of themselves as stormtroopers. If they know soldiers or they know veterans, they don't like thinking of those people as stormtroopers. So it's more difficult to persuade people that they live in a regime that's evil. It is easier to persuade people that they live in a regime that's stupid, where people are making honest mistakes, uh, where they mean well, but they're nonetheless blundering around doing things they shouldn't be doing. I think that's a more persuasive message. So I often try to encourage people to give the benefit of the doubt when they're making anti-imperialist critiques to the people in government and say, well, maybe they're not deliberately being vicious. Maybe they are just making a mistake. Because I think that is easier to go down, easier for people to wrap their heads around.
Okay, and I see that it may be harder to sell someone on a different worldview, but the question, comes down to, let's say you drop the anti-imperialistic message. That's kind of well. Let me backtrack a little bit. Let's say you decided to drop the anti-imperialistic message. I think we've had examples where, in our own country here, the left sort of dropped, well, excuse me, let me say the mainstream left sort of dropped the caring for the poor and being a good steward of the public commons and things of that nature. They kind of dropped that because it wasn't selling at the time. And what, look at the results that actually, kind of set in motion. Here we
Yeah,
are,
I think
30
this
years
is a little
later.
different because in this case, we're often talking about the same policy. We want us to not intervene in a country, usually. Uh, and we're arguing for the policy we could argue for on anti-imperialist grounds, but we're instead arguing for it on the basis that, well, we can't be sure what the intentions of the people in government are, but it's a mistake. It's not good for us to do this. And so we're still arguing for the same policy. We're just arguing for it in a way that maybe is more appealing. Whereas I agree with you that we should not have triangulated on poverty and welfare, because not only did we change the way that we argued, we changed the policies we supported. And that's a much bigger sacrifice to make. So I would make that distinction between cases where you're changing the argument to make it more appealing and meeting people where they're at, and cases where you're changing the policy and committing your political movement to doing something that is destructive.
Okay, let me ask you this then. If Bernie Sanders' message was continuing in Obama's message, but Jill Stein's message is radically different, there is both a change in the way they're selling it, but there is also a change in policy. While I do, excuse me, while I do agree that perhaps cutting the military budget by 80% cannot be done top of a hat, right? It's a big ship. You have to start to wind it down. And of course, you have to grow other industries and things of that nature for people to actually have employment and actually make it work as a system. You can't just, turn it around without, unnecessary pain, right, for people. But at the same time, Bernie Sanders didn't actually express those views. He just talked mostly about, wanting to pull back from regime change. So I would say that those are definitely different policies. So what do you think would be the consequences of, let's say, the left dropping anti-imperialism in both policy and rhetoric and going towards a more
Well,
cautionary thing?
yeah, I think there's a case to be made that even if you triangulate on mostly just the rhetoric, there would be some policies that would come along with it. Uh, we've seen that with Bernie. Bernie didn't commit as much as Stein did to certain kinds of changes that he would not be able to get public support for, or at least that he did not believe he would be able to get public support for. And while that's regrettable, all I can really say is that in terms of public support, Stein did not campaign as effectively. Her percentage in the polls in June, when people didn't know very much about her, was close to 5%, which is the threshold you need to qualify for federal funding for a third party. But by now it's at about 1.8, so she's lost more than half her support. And her favorability figure went from about 24% negative to 38% negative. So the plus minus difference, she was at about -5, and now she's at more like -20. Bernie was able to avoid that because Bernie tried to radicalize the public predominantly on economic policy. And with the foreign policy, he took the best parts of what Obama would do relative to what Clinton would do and emphasized those parts.